Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the User First and Viscardi Center webinar, Accessibility for Your Digital Presence. Before we get started, I want to just go over a few housekeeping items. So next slide, please. Closed caption is available for this webinar. You can select it at the bottom of your screen. You can submit questions via the Q&A window at the end. We're going to open up that window for questions. If you have trouble using Q&A, you're welcome to email David Frischio. He's our techie today, as well as you can put questions in the chat and we will try to accommodate them there and talk to them. You can also join by telephone if you wish for audio services. Next slide, please. So today's agenda, we're going to cover the fundamentals of web and document accessibility. What is digital accessibility? What is the potential market and buying power? How accessibility can create an engaging experience for all your users and improve your brand loyalty. And what are the guidelines of ADA compliance and what steps you could take to mitigate your lawsuit risk, as well as what is WCAG and what do all those guidelines mean? And how do you test for errors and actually implement accessibility standards so that you can fix your site. Next slide, please. So what is digital accessibility? It's often misunderstood or not understood at all on several levels. There's a massive knowledge gap and a lot of misinformation out there, so we're going to attempt to clear a lot of that up for you today. For example, at User First, we often get questions or comments such as, this is just a compliance thing and doesn't increase the bottom line to my business. And while compliance is certainly a concern, there are definitely business benefits to making all of your digital assets accessible. Speaking of the compliance perspective, we also get questions like, where in ADA can I find the specifics for how I can make my website and other digital assets accessible? So we'll go through some of that information today. Some people also have a very negative view of accessibility. For example, they say, I know web accessibility, it's just alt tags and it's tedious and time consuming. And then there's a very narrow view of who the audience is actually using your site. Some people have actually said to us, we don't know if any blind or visually impaired people use our site. And this doesn't account for other disabilities such as motor skills or cognitive challenges that your users may have. Simply stated, digital accessibility ensures that all users, including those with varied abilities and disabilities, can use your website, app, and other digital assets like online forms, PDF documents, things like that, to have equal access to your services, goods, and information. Your digital assets should be able to accommodate people with visual, auditory, motor, or cognitive impairments. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to turn things over to Vice President User First, Sean Pike, to discuss the importance of digital accessibility in today's legal landscape. Sean?
Thank you, Reagan. I appreciate the introduction. And to everyone in the audience, welcome from in the United States and around the world even. I saw someone from Mexico is joining us, and I think a few others from around the world are, so that's exciting. I hope everyone is staying healthy and safe during these trying times and are hunkered down and have everything they need. So next slide, please. Let's talk about the legal landscape. So if we go over just at a very high level as far as where this all comes in and why it's important. Number one, there is a significant upside in web accessibility that is often not discussed, as Reagan talked about, and that's the ability to capture more users and capture more revenue. Or in the case, if you're a nonprofit, an educational institution, or other organization, you're growing your footprint and delivering your services better. We deal with it all the time in the digital marketing arena, where we're looking at how do we essentially capture this user base or that user base. People with disabilities are left out of the conversation, which is amazing if you look at the numbers, which we can talk about a little bit more. You are also trying to improve the user experience and increase brand loyalty. That goes hand in hand with capture more users. How do you make the experience such that they keep wanting to come back, that they use word of mouth to talk about your brand, and ultimately, again, grow your reputation in addition to your user base. And then finally, this one comes up as the most talked about topic and is certainly important. Comply with guidelines and reduce litigation risk. And there's a number of dynamics with that that we'll go into. Next slide, please. So capture more customers. I mentioned I'd talk about some of the numbers here. You can see them on the slide, but it is significant. Having been in many marketing organizations that talk about capturing a certain demographic and having seen that people with disabilities are left out, it's somewhat alarming. If you are an e-commerce company, if you are reliant of your online presence to really grow your organization, this is something you should be thinking about. Just in the way as people, when they come to a website that they don't like, if they are fully abled, they leave very quickly. We measure things in digital marketing in milliseconds. So people with disabilities, when they get frustrated with your site, studies have shown that they will leave a lot faster and they won't come back. On the reverse side of it, studies also show that there is a stronger brand loyalty with people with disabilities because when they find an accommodation that they like on a certain website, they're very loyal because they recognize that those efforts have been made for them. And in addition to these numbers, these are the direct numbers. The power of networks are also talked about a great deal. Think about their family and friends, word of mouth, and the ripple effects it can have on your business in general. It's certainly a topic worth discussing. Next slide, please. There are the figures that came out of the American Institutes for Research of disposable income, significantly more than many other demographics that you might be looking at selling towards. So please think of those as you're looking at increasing your user base. Next slide, please. So the legal landscape is the one that we get the most questions about regarding web accessibility. And as referenced here on the slide, the blog ADA Title3.com does a great job at Safe Arth and Shaw of manually looking at these statistics and reading through all of the lawsuits. To give you an idea, when they started tracking them in 2013, I think yearly there were about 2,800 lawsuits. You can see where it has gone now, and that number, even with the most recent one, has started to go up even more, closer to 11,000 actually. These are ones that are able to be sourced. They're not all the lawsuits out there because there's a lot of complexity to our court system. The overall point is that the pressure is increasing immensely. It is increasing certainly in those states you see geographically, but not only those states. There's a lot of other areas where the pressure has gone up in delivering web accessibility. It is, contrary to popular belief, more of a consequence of critical services and even convenient services moving online and away from the physical realm more than it is with the drive-by lawsuits that people are concerned about. Usually there are folks with very legitimate reasons to be concerned about their ability to do things like online banking, online education, etc. Next slide, please. So one of the more popular cases that happened recently was having to do with Domino's. A claim was made against Domino's that they did not provide equal access online for their ordering service. Domino's took exception to it and appealed it all the way to the Supreme Court. At the end of the day, the Supreme Court declined to review the case, which essentially has really ensured that these cases will continue. And they have appealed it at the lower circuit court, I believe, but nothing has happened there yet. Domino's is really a string of major brands being involved in these lawsuits all the way back to a lawsuit really that started with Target in 2007 to really address this question of equal access on the web. What I can tell you what it means for your organization and what's really important here is your organization should be coming up with some sort of plan and start taking action on it sooner rather than later because of the escalation here. And again, as before, because it can grow your business and certainly help out. Next slide, please. There's the stat again, kind of emphasizing the point that the trend is not going away. You can see if you are in retail that you should be definitely concerned about it because retail, as everyone knows, has moved online at an incredible pace and will only continue, I think, given the current circumstances. Next slide, please. So what I consult a lot of clients on and help them understand is really establishing your risk profile, so to say, is really usually a custom exercise depending on your organization. Depending on who you are, and there's a list here of a lot of regulations on that touch web accessibility in one way or another and equal access. But depending on your organization, you really have to first ascertain your risk. And in order to do that, you have to understand the current compliance environment. You have to understand what regulations you are under, and you have to understand other factors such as geographic area and how it affects your specific web properties. Do you have a few applications in addition to a site? And do you have a plan mapped out for web accessibility regarding your entire ecosystem in the digital realm? When you are able to do that and really set a baseline and understand where you're at, you can actually build a good plan. You can apply interesting technologies like those sold by User First that help deliver the fixing part of accessibility, which of course is the end goal. Next slide, please. Jim? Reagan, I'll let you introduce Jim, and Jim, I'll let you take it away.
Hi, next we're moving on to document accessibility and how it relates as well to users with disabilities. And Jim Corporal from the Viscardi Center joins us today. And so Jim, we're gonna let you take it away from here.
Terrific. Thank you, Reagan. Thank you, Sean, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you today, and I'm happy to talk about accessibility with respect to electronic documents. We're going to get a little bit technical just to give you a flavor for how this works, but next slide, please. So what exactly is document accessibility? Well, it starts with the software coding or editing process performed by someone who specializes in accessibility authoring techniques. Basically, we ensure that your digital content is accessible by all of your internal, your external viewers, including those with low vision and blindness who utilize assistive technology such as screen reading software. And a very popular program is called JAWS, and that's spelled J-A-W-S, and that stands for Job Access with Speech. When Adobe PDF files, for example, Microsoft Word documents, PowerPoint presentations are made accessible through remediation, paragraph headings are marked, the paragraph structures are set, the charts, lists, graphs, and tables are modified and adapted, and photos, images, and graphics are descriptively tagged, and forms may be generated with fillable fields so that the screen reader can read the content accurately, efficiently, and in the order in which the author intended it to be. Now, today we're going to show you a video that we made of an actual client document before and after going through our remediation process, just to highlight the experience of a user who is blind attempting to read an inaccessible document. So David, can we please show the video now?
Here's a document that we received from our client, which hasn't been remediated, or in other words, made accessible. Notice what happens when the user tries to access it with the screen reading software.
NBDC Flyer Pre-Remediation.pdf-Adobe Acrobat Pro DC 3 graphic page has no links. NBDC Flyer Pre-Remediation.pdf 3 graphic 3.
Notice how the screen reader detected an error and couldn't read the document. Imagine how frustrating that would be for a user. Without being remediated, a blind user cannot access the information provided in the document. Now, here's the same document after our team remediated it and addressed any accessibility issues.
NBDC flyer poster remediation.pdf document. Page has 3 headings and 2 links. NBDC flyer poster remediation.pdf. Series of 4 images of people with various disabilities actively employed. Graphic. National Business and Disability Council at the Viscardi Center logo. Heading level 1. How are you recognizing national disability? Heading level 1. Employment Awareness Month. Heading level 2. Join us at the Viscardi Center for a celebration and tips. Heading level 2 for meeting your diversity and inclusion goals.
You can hear that after the document was remediated, the screen reader successfully and accurately read the content in the correct reading order, including description of images and the number of links present, giving the user the same full experience as a sighted reader.
Thank you, David. Next slide, please. So hopefully you could see the experience of a user trying to access a document that hasn't been made accessible and one that has. You can clearly see that when a document's remediated, the user is able to navigate the document. I wanted to point out also that the Adobe software, the Adobe Reader, does have a feature, and that's called Adobe Read Aloud, and it's a great attempt at conveying the information on a page or a PDF. However, it's limited to a certain extent in that it doesn't allow a user to navigate a document. It literally just starts from the top of the page and reads down. You really can't control it. When a document is remediated correctly, again, things like headings are marked so that a user, for instance, if it's a 50-page document, they can go to the table of contents and they can go to chapter 3 and navigate and kind of cut to the chase, so to speak. So although Adobe has a read aloud feature, it's helpful, but it's not comprehensive by any stretch. So just one example of why you'd want to have your document remediated for true compliance and accessibility. Next slide, please, Dave. So what type of materials should be made accessible? There are many. They include employee handbooks, job applications, new and legacy documents posted on school district websites, company, government, and agency websites, materials and worksheets for students, and mortgage applications, just to name a few. Basically, as a rule of thumb, any document that might be used by the public, your customers, your employees, or other stakeholders should be made accessible. Next slide, please. Okay, so how do we do it? Well, documents are usually created using traditional authoring tools like Microsoft Word or Google Docs. In some cases where no electronic version of a previously created document exists, the document needs to be scanned into a digital file format. These digital files contain something called metadata or tags, and these tags identify the elements we spoke about earlier, the headings, the paragraph structure, charts, lists and tables, etc. Now, using proprietary software, we assess the file, modify these tags to adhere to compliance rules, which gets us about 75 to 90% of the way home. We then need to review the document for any photos, images, and graphics, and manually insert descriptive text for each so that the screen reading software knows what to read to a viewer when it comes upon a particular image, for example. Alternative text is basically a written description of the image. It's much like a caption. Once we're happy with the descriptive text entries, we then perform a quality check by, quote, listening to the document using JAWS, and where we confirm all is as it should be. In particular, the reading order is correct, and the figures and images are appropriately described. And then the final step to quality assurance is to check the remediated file for compliance. So all of the guidelines and rules that we hear about, and Sean mentioned earlier, WCAG, Section 508, HHS, there are checkers that we run against these files to make sure that they pass all of those guidelines. Things like Microsoft Word has a built-in accessibility checker tool, and then we also use something called a PDF accessibility checker, which is a free tool, and that checks for over 140 criteria inside of the PDF itself. If the checkers report any errors, we go back and we correct and retest until the file passes. We then deliver the remediated document back to the owner. Next slide, please. Again, as Sean mentioned, there's also a strong business case for accessibility. A new report on disability inclusion from Disability In and Accenture shows that companies that lead the way in disability inclusion report that they have 28% higher revenue. They have 2 times higher net income, 30% better performance on profit margin. So again, the business case there is certainly present. In the marketplace, accessible digital files ensure current and prospective customers have access to all products and services materials. Various surveys have shown the low vision population is growing, with over 21 million adults with non-correctable vision. So again, to complement the disposable and discretionary income slides, the amount in the population is staggering. And from a marketing and revenue perspective alone, that number is quite formidable. Just think how nice it would be to suddenly have access to 21 more people than you do today. Next slide, please. And lastly, there's a tangible social return on investment for accessibility, and organizations that promote it are rewarded in kind. Accessible digital materials in the workplace boost employee productivity for those with and without disclosed disabilities, and plays a role in the hiring, retention, and advancement of individuals with disabilities. In a school setting, for example, it allows children with visual and physical disabilities to fully engage in the classroom and work more independently. Accessibility supports social inclusion for people with disabilities as well as the aging population, and those living in rural areas and people in developing countries. Accessibility with respect to documents also benefits people without disabilities by providing a more enjoyable end user experience. Documents are much easier to navigate, they're more descriptive, and they keep the viewer engaged. Okay, that'll wrap up my portion on document accessibility. Hopefully, I went into enough detail to give you a sense of what's involved. If you have any questions, again, we'll try to address them at the end of the webinar. Sean, where do organizations go from here, and how can they make their digital assets accessible?
Great, thanks, Jim. And that was a good overview going over a lot of those things that are important, and some of them very specific to document remediation, and there's overlap with websites as well there. So the only worldwide standard that's acceptable and out there to follow, which is a very good one, is called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. I refer to it as the holy grail of remediation because it really is the how-to area that shows you the guidelines by which you make your site, your document accessible, or even another digital asset such as a kiosk. So the WCAG guidelines themselves break things down under 4 macro areas, and then within each of those areas, they have particular techniques and recommendations for making your website accessible. Those 4 areas are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And each of them cover specific things that you may have to do in order to make your digital asset accessible. So as an example, when we look at something like perceivable, it means really the user can identify content and interface elements by means of the senses. For many users, this means perceiving a system primarily visually, while for others, it might be sound or touch, for instance, if they are using a screen reader. Operable means a user can successfully use controls, buttons, and navigation menus. There are a lot of cases we run into where, for instance, we talk to a nonprofit, even large organizations, and we say, hey, do you know your donate button is not fully accessible? So Jim talked about some of those numbers. So an organization that relies completely on donations basically has shuttered out a large part of the population that can digitally click that donate button. It wasn't operable, as an example. Understandable mean it is consistent in presentation and format, right? That you can essentially modularize what you use over and over again in order so that someone can understand the framework of the digital asset you have, and it's deployed in multiple areas so it can be reusable. And robust means it has to work with with all technologies, browsers, screen readers, etc. It has to be able to interact with websites, online documents, multimedia, and other information formats. So that's at a high level. There are very specific techniques and criteria under WCAG. You can find it online. It is put out by the World Wide Web Consortium, which is the standards body for the internet. They are the ones that make sure that principles like these for web accessibility apply, but also greater principles in web design that frankly allow the internet to operate as well as it does. Next slide, please. So what do you do, right? Where do you even start? I did talk earlier about, establishing your policies and really understanding your risk as one component of it. But when you get to the actual, how do I test and fix what the errors are? There are recommendations that are pretty consistent, both coming from various regulatory bodies in the United States government, from international governments, and even state and local governments. You can start by understanding and establishing some sort of continuous testing methodology. In web accessibility, it's well known in the industry, but not by most people, that automated tests only pick up approximately 40% of the WCAG guidelines. You do need someone to manually go in and also be able to source out certain errors that may have to do with certain things like keyboard usage and screen reader usage. This is necessary because someone has to actually establish whether context has been met in as an example of a WCAG principle. Has the user been able to understand the context of what they're doing? If you imagine that you are visually impaired, if you are blind and you're listening to things, think of context as in if you were listening to a book being read to you left to right, top to bottom. Well, what if it was read backwards, right? Or read in pieces. You don't have appropriate context. So manual testing is critical. You should always ask whatever vendor or service you use, what are they doing for manual testing? Remediation, actually fixing the accessibility barriers themselves. There's good news here and bad news here. The good news is everyone can pull at the rope. There are content errors that can be fixed by people that are not developers, that are not coding. You can, for instance, alt tags is the most prominent example. You can fix your alt tags. Content managers, folks in marketing can do that. Where we run into the biggest challenges is when you have to get into the code and actually ensure it's accessible. Whether you're doing it, you have developers in-house, or whether you're enforcing it through procurement and working with your third-party vendor, you have to make sure that at the code level, there's accessibility implemented as well. So there's two methods there. There's pros and cons to both. A lot of it really depends on your resources. You have to establish what resources do you have to really take this on. Can they do it? What progress can they make? And how do you map that back to your risk profile in order to come up with the best plan possible? And then continuous testing and monitoring. This is very much akin to something like cybersecurity in a technical sense. It's not something that you could just do once and go and stop and go away. And if you think about it, because your digital assets change and you update content, you really have to put some sort of process in place to embed it in what you do. For a lot of organizations, that doesn't have to be anything drastically large as far as an enormous effort or center of excellence, but there is effort that has to be put forth, and the mentality needs to change to make sure it becomes part of your normal digital release processes. Next slide, please. Some considerations and some solutions directly and in which you can go to for websites. So consider your policy. A website accessibility policy is usually in most settlement agreements done by the Department of Justice is talked about. Make a policy that makes people aware that you are working on it and that you have a plan and that you're aspiring to certain standards, and those would be WCAG nearly every single time in order to support them. Look at universal design as a mechanism. We have developers join user first because they basically, one recently in particular said that I realized that web accessibility design is also great design. So if I learn how to design with web accessibility in mind, the overall quality of my code and my outputs are going to increase. And those are all rooted in the principles of universal design. Those can be very important. As we talked about, implementing the appropriate WCAG standards, again, depending on your organization, that might vary or be different. And you can see some of the others on the left-hand side. As far as solutions, there's third-party plugins that provide accessibility as a service. User First has one, and there are others out there. There's automated testing solutions that help you start to orient where you're at. Combine it with manual audits with assistive technologies, and you're really testing at the rate you should be. You can do it yourself, as I mentioned, at the source code. And of course, to really just establish first and foremost where you're at, you can get a full audit, which involves automated and manual testing. Don't forget training. Training can be important, especially if you're taking it in-house to make sure that your developers and designers are up to speed. Next slide, please. Native mobile apps are a little bit different. There's a lot of overlap there, but let me highlight the important differences you should remember. Most native mobile apps, with only one exception, have to be coded at the source code level because they are in proprietary frameworks like iOS, the App Store, right, or the Google Store. So really, all work for fixing has to be done at the source code level, and manual testing has to be done for it as well there. It really is important that you're hiring or currently training developers and designers to build those apps correctly. Websites are mostly targeted in compliance complaints, but native mobile apps are starting to pick up as an awareness on that end. Next slide, please. Well, I guess that brings us to the end here. I'll pass it back to Reagan to close us out. I want to thank Jim and the Biscardi Center again. They do a terrific job, and they're the best. They're the best at document remediation, and we love working with them. So, Jim, thanks again, and Reagan, I'll pass it to you.
Yes, we're not closing out, so nobody jump offline. Sorry about that. We're at this time. We're going to take questions, and we're going to get to some. I saw some in the chats. I also saw one that's in the wait, so I will read those questions and offer them to our panelists. Also, I was remiss in the beginning of letting you all know that, like everybody, we are social distancing, and we are all in different places and in the privacy of our homes. So if you hear any strange noises in the background, we do apologize from our panelists because we can't control sometimes the outside noise that happens. So right now we're gonna, David, if you'll go ahead and open the question box, that would be great. And I know Eduardo had a couple questions in the chat, and he said, I have a question for later about the widget and whether that is considered AA or AAA or neither. So Eduardo, could you explain maybe what widget you're talking about, or? And we'll see if he can post a response or if he hopped off. Oh, no, here it goes. The website widget that User First offers. Okay, Eduardo, if you wouldn't mind, we'd like to talk about that offline because we aren't going to talk about our products and services that we offer in this webinar. It's for educational purposes on digital accessibility. And we'd like to hold the integrity of our webinars to that and not a direct sales pitch or information on our products. But we are happy to get in touch with you after and talk to you about our You Remediate widget, which is the one you're referring to. So we do appreciate that question, though, and we're going to get right back to you after the webinar is over. Audrey has asked a great question, and Sean, this is one we get all the time, and Jim, I'm sure you guys probably get it too. Does ADA apply to all websites, business to business or just business to consumer? So how does ADA apply, really, is what she's asking.
It's a good question, and depending on your organization, but it sounds like you're talking about commercial business, certainly one way or another, whether B2B or B2C. So ADA applies to all websites. It's the law of the land, and that's across the area. If you are a commercial entity, it's Title III, and you're held to the reasonable accommodation standard. But it does apply to all websites. I get questions on that quite a bit, or someone calls me and says, I had a private school call the other day and say, oh, well, we're not really liable to ADA, and that's akin to saying you're not liable to free speech, or it's just not true. It is the law of the land, so it does apply to all websites.
I know one
Yeah,
of the things to
Reagan,
clarify.
sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
One
Reagan,
of the
it's
things.
Jim.
Sorry, go ahead, Jim.
Sorry, yeah, but working from home, this is what happens.
Right?
Just to reiterate what Sean was saying, and there is a lot of misinformation about whether it applies to all websites, and he's exactly correct. And just to kind of drive home the point, any federal agency is required by their own mandates that they need to have all of their material accessible. And not only the agency itself, but any vendor that has a government contract, or any vendor that works with a federal agency, and even state agencies now also have to have all of their materials made accessible. So it's a little bit of a nuance to this question about, do we have to be accessible, and you certainly do. You can't get a government contract if you're not making your digital information accessible. So I just kind of wanted to drive home the point a little bit. Thank you.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, what the Ninth Circuit Court said in the Domino's case was that it applies to places of public accommodation, and therefore extends to your website, especially if you have a brick and mortar business. It is still a question in the courts whether online businesses alone, whether that applies or not. So we'll have to actually explore that one as case law comes about and as it moves through the courts. But as of right now, it is public places of public accommodation, which includes your digital assets. Paige has asked us a question. I work for federally funded grant training state certificate childcare workers. Wow, that's federally funded in state. You got a lot of combinations going on there, Paige. Housed at public university. Although the state can refuse to certify people with disabilities, are we still liable for making our training accessible?
That's a great question. And Reagan, I could take that one.
Okay.
So basically what you have to identify, which it sounds like is the case, is organizations that receive federal funding are also held to standards of web accessibility, and that falls under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 for recipients that receive federal financial assistance. So that does touch educational institutions, and I believe, Reagan, she said it was housed in an educational institution.
At a public university, yeah.
Yes, a public university. A public university has essentially two important civil rights pieces of regulation it has to follow. ADA Title II, right? Because it can be issued it is a public entity, and ADA Title II covers state and local governments because you're a public institution. And then two, as aforementioned, there's Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So I would be, we could talk about if there's more specifics on exactly the training platform and certain nuances, but it sure sounds to me like those are the areas you're under. What that means is you hypothetically, I think, could receive an Office of Civil Rights complaint from the Department of Education. They work with the Department of Justice in order to do enforcement on public institutions, and they have a whole process for it. So it gets a little complicated, but I don't think, I certainly don't think you're off the hook. And there's some nuance there. So feel free to reach out to us if you want to talk about it more. Jim, I don't know if you had anything to add to that, but that's my interpretation from the question.
Yeah, I concur 100%, Sean. And again, it gets back to, my earlier point about, working with federal agencies where that money is provided from the federal government, which, by the way, is all of us. I agree 100%. And, the other thing too, this is also somewhat of a gray area when we get to the private industries. Our feeling is it's better to err on the side of caution. We're not going to get into costs and things like that, like Reagan said. But if it's not terribly expensive to do these things, especially if you plan it correctly, you build it in up front. Like Sean, you were saying earlier, with these design methodologies in place, you're actually building a better product. As I mentioned earlier, the PDF documents were much more readable, and so I think it's again just we're not going to get into the legal discussion too much here, but to err on the side of caution, I think is just good advice, and I'll kind of leave it at that. But thanks, guys.
Thank you both. We have another question from Eduardo. He's asking about, are the 2.1 WCAG requirements currently being enforced? And I think we have yet to see that. Eduardo, I'm actually asking our counsel about your questions, because your next one is, or are they currently lawsuits based on 2.0 standards?
Reagan, I can comment on that, having read a number of them if you want me to.
Yeah, well, he just responded to me as well. So
Okay.
He said the current lawsuits are referencing WCAG 2.1.
Yeah, they are. I've read a number of them, and they do reference 2.1. Some of them reference 2.0. But yeah, the current lawsuits we've seen, especially this year, are referencing 2.1 in the commercial space, specifically for ADA Title III lawsuits.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sean. Are there any overlaps with accessibility and SEO, search engine optimization? If so, what are some of the areas to focus on? Sean, I know you and I have talked about that pretty extensively, so why don't you take that one?
Yeah, it's a good question. It becomes somewhat of a technical one as well, but the short answer is there are benefits with web accessibility and SEO. There's some debate out there as to how advantageous it is, but it is becoming more advantageous. Big companies like Google that basically provide search engine options based on order rankings based on certain merits. They do seem to be doing more with web accessibility as one of them. So if you're providing an accessible experience, you're doing a few things. One, you're likely providing a clean experience in the first place that gets you better SEO. And then two, those actual web accessibility considerations themselves. So, it's we can certainly send you more information on that, but it certainly doesn't hurt. It certainly helps. Reagan, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else on that.
No, Jim, do you have any additional perspective on that? Have you guys looked at search engine optimization?
So it's not, doesn't really come into play too much with the remediation work that we do, Reagan, but I can see, again, how we describe alternative text for various images. I could see it applying to websites where if you're more descriptive, of course, your site, your information is going to come up more frequently. So just a little bit different for PDFs, really perhaps more of a website question, but thanks.
Mm-hmm. So one interesting aspect that we've seen come up in one of the more recent regulations in California that's under, it's out for public comment right now, but we're pretty sure it's going to be finalized, is their CCPA requirement for businesses who operate in California and meet certain standards it's actually one of the first regulations that included WCAG standards in the regulation. And like we said, it's out for public comment right now. We fully anticipate this to be finalized. But the interesting part about this regulation is that it's for online documents. And that's one reason why we're partners and we're sharing this with the Viscardi Center. And I'm going to let both Sean and Jim address this issue, because it's very interesting, because the regulation says your online documents must be accessible. And from a web accessibility standpoint, if you can't get to that document because your website's not accessible, then what happens? So it's just an interesting conundrum that's kind of come up, and I'll let Jim address it first, and then you can pass it over to Sean.
Yeah, thanks, Reagan. Yeah, we talk about this all the time, and as we travel around, the country at various trade shows and conferences, and of course we speak about PDF remediation, but people often come up to us and ask about the other components of digital materials. And if you have your PDF document made accessible, that's great. But if you're publishing it through your website and your website isn't accessible, then your site visitors aren't going to be able to basically navigate to that PDF. So it's extremely important that your compliance strategy addresses all of the digital components. And again, at a high level, it's the website itself. Everyone's website today pretty much has some type of downloadable material, PDF documents, and of course everyone's got sometimes, or mostly everyone has a video of some sort, right? And those videos need to be captioned so that those can be accessible as well. So you kind of have those three major components that really need to be addressed when you are thinking about making sure that you're fully compliant in your digital presence. And I think, Sean, I don't know if you can add a little bit more to that.
Jim, I think you actually covered it pretty well. So no, I'm actually good on my end. Reagan, back to you. See if there are more questions.
Yeah, I actually have one that has come up on previous webinars that I think, Sean, would be great for you to address here. Oftentimes with our retail customers, as well as people who just ask us questions about their retail sites, is acceptable a combination, I have a phone number? Well, they can call if they need to order something. Is that considered a reasonable accommodation? And this is actually what led to the Domino's case. But Sean, retailers are still asking this question of, well, they can still call and order, or they can call and get their services. Would you like to address that question?
So it's a complicated legal question because it's been interpreted very differently. But what I would say is that you cannot assume that that is necessarily the case. As Reagan mentioned with Domino's, they ruled that the service provided online was not equitable as for having a phone number to call in on. So, there's probably dependencies with exactly your organization and what you do. But I will say that from what I've seen, the case law determines that that's not, that is not the case. There are certain rulings out there that talk about, if you think about it, right, the ability to gain access on a service or gain information, is a 24/7 thing online, right? For the most part. So, there's discrepancies there, but it's a tricky question. And again, I would not assume that that is the case, and that argument has not proven well. It didn't prove well for Domino's, and in many other case law, it has not proven well as well. So, you have to think about the different dynamics.
We are getting close to the end of our time. So David, next slide, please. I want to thank both Sean and Jim for joining us today, leading us in this discussion. And also, we'll get a way for you guys to get questions to us. We'd like to encourage you to follow User First, as well as the Viscardi Center. They have theirs on social media, on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. We'd like you to follow both organizations. We put out regular information on digital and web accessibility. And next slide, please. You can contact User First with any additional questions via our phone number right here on the screen, as well as accessibility@userfirst.com. Visit our website. There's contact information there as well. Once you get to our website and our email, that's probably the best way, since we're all working from home, to reach us. For the Viscardi Center, if you have any questions on document remediation, please contact Jim Corporal at the Viscardi Center. And there's the Viscardi Center website as well. Forgive me. Okay. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. And again, if you want to submit any questions we didn't get to offline, we'll be happy to get back to you with those answers. Eduardo, we'll have somebody reach out to you about the questions that you had regarding our digital software. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day, and be safe and be healthy, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.